My name is Russell Southwood. I run a consultancy and research company called Balancing Act, which I've run over 25 years, focused on sub-Saharan Africa, looking at telecoms, internet, and media. I'm also the author of a book, Africa 2.0, Inside a Continent's Communications Revolution, which looks
Welcome
at
to the
that
African Tech Roundup,
25-year
Russell.
history of digital,
Treat to
all
have you
things
on.
digital,
I know you've done some
and
writing for us at least once
communications in
before, and
sub-Saharan
so
Africa.
some of our audience will be familiar with your insights. Many of them
good
will
to
have
be
read your
here.
book or interacted with you in person at the numerous conferences you've spoken and moderated at over the years. Certainly, many of them will know you personally in your work as a consultant. Thinking back to your first day in being part of what we now consider or take for granted as being Africa's tech ecosystem, what stands out to you as the most significant change? Think of that very first day, whether it was like your first consulting opportunity, your first visit to the continent, your first boardroom dive. Take me back.
I think what was interesting was I read an article by John Perry Barlow in Wired magazine, which was in 2000, and he had made a sort of similar trip to the continent. And John Perry Barlow was the lyricist with the Grateful Dead and was a member of the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, and came to Africa looking at the potential of the internet. And some part of what he said was crazy, but some other part was also very interesting because it was about jumping kind of industrial revolution and focusing on what the new economy was going to do. And he had some idea of the idea of a new economy. And in those days, when we came to Africa, there was almost nobody involved in the internet. The numbers of people interested in the internet were in the hundreds or the thousands. And as I got more and more involved in it, there were lots and lots of people around who were enthusiastic, who saw the internet as, if you like, the key to opening up potential. You have to think back to what a depressing place Africa was in the late 1980s, early 1990s. You were talking about I always remember the man who used to rule Togo was ruling Togo when I was in my teens at school and was still ruling Togo all those decades later. And his son now rules Togo. So that was the kind of stasis. And also you have things like apartheid and the frontline states and the damage that did to the economies of many of the countries of Africa. So that it was like nothing was happening. Africa was always the victim. There was no agency. There was no sense of the continent doing something for itself. It was always being done to. And it seemed to me that digital, and I was not alone in this, there were other enthusiasts around, and people like Ethan Zuckerman and Mark Davis from Busy Internet and people like that, all of whom thought this is the magic sauce. What I realized actually quite quickly was that there wasn't really effective internet to be doing these sorts of things. So either you had to do one of two things. You either had to get effective internet into place, or you did it with text messages on a mobile phone. And some people went down that route, and that was perfectly legitimate. But it did seem to me that all of the barriers that were preventing Africa from getting the internet had to be dealt with. So I certainly in my personal journey, it was something like an 8-year going round the bottom of the mountain journey simply to get to the start of the track. In that journey, what we did was we looked at the liberalization of markets. We looked at how to break the monopoly of international cables. And we looked at how the financing of international cables could produce the kind of underlying economies of scale that would allow an African internet to develop.
So what were you doing, though?
And that
for
was
someone who
8 to 10 years.
No
and that, as I say, that really just took you to the start
that
of
would
the
have brought
track,
you
which
to
was
Africa in
about
the first
2008,
place,
2009.
nurtured an interest in these things to begin with. Maybe there's a hint in you attending the University of London SOAS, or is it SOAS University of London? I can't remember how you say it. I think that university seems to breed your sorts. But no, what would you point to as your interest in Africa as a place to explore these themes and, I suppose, launch a career?
I came, I suppose, from the left of the political spectrum, and I was beginning to develop arguments with people who were in development about what development was about and arguments about the need to focus on creating wealth. So in other words, a lot of the arguments in development had been about who got wealth, and particularly a lot of the Marxist arguments of the 1970s were about taking wealth away from people, whereas it seemed to me that Africa needed more capitalism rather than less, and it was going to be its sector, the state, that would develop this kind of industry. Because if you remember back to the telecoms incumbents of Africa in the early 2000s, you would apply by form for a phone line, and it would take 3 months, and you had to submit enormous amounts of paperwork and so on and so forth. I suppose one of the biggest early changes was that
This is quite
you
something,
walked into a
framing that
shop
as an innovation.
selling mobile phones, walked out with the phone. And that was a very difficult approach. No, absolutely. But I mean, it was because the state was a form of patronage. The people who got the phones more easily were civil servants, were the families of people associated with politicians. You know, a small class of people got access to this very vital form of communication. And that was all upended by mobile. It might only have been voice, but actually it was all upended by capitalism providing it in a particular way, and in a way that was also competitive, that drove down prices and all those kinds of arguments. I might make a very different set of arguments now, but actually that was the beginning of it. And it does seem to me, if I think back, when I started doing the newsletter that I did, which was distributed by email, I can remember a terrible moment at a conference somewhere in, I think it was South Africa, trying to send the email with the newsletter on a dial-up connection, and hours
That might
passed
even
and it
rival certain
still
parts of
wasn't
Europe.
going. And now, if you go to most African cities, you've got an internet that works, you know. Exactly. And the power goes down, and there's all number of X factors that are perhaps not quite as imposing as they are in places like London or Sheffield, but actually the internet now does work, which raises then a whole set of different issues, because it does seem to me that the thing about Africa is that Africa's the same as anywhere else.
Sounds like
a
press
recent
release you
announcement
might
by
get.
MTN is that they're going to be doing fiber to the home in one of their big territories, exactly the same as Europe. You get round to it, you put fiber to the home in. Yeah, any kind of country in Europe or America or whatever. But actually, Africa's different. And it's that constant race
So what
between
makes
those
you an
two different things,
interesting
or trying to hold those
conversationalist,
two different
among
things in
other
your
things,
mind,
is
that
your
makes it
first-hand
such an
experience and
interesting
perspectives
place.
on two fronts, which are of great interest to me as the sort of editorial lead of African Tech Roundup, which is the imagined digital economy, which in many people's minds dwarfs anything real or tangible any of us could interact with every day, in a way that's truly an imaginary for the most part, or sometimes naively at worst, really just a projection for a future we all hope for. But there's something real to that notion, this idea of a digital economy. But then there's the real economy, where all the stuff that makes sure that leads to us living the lives of everyday Africans, for those of us still on the continent or anywhere else in the world, frankly, and still interacting meaningfully with the continent. Things we take for granted, like ensuring, the plantain we like to eat from that store we like to buy it from is available. Or, to your point, the phone call we want to make when we're on our way home can be done, or the WhatsApp exchanges that lead to perhaps the sale of a goat that we've been fattening for a celebration. I'm digging in my own experience as an African. These are things quite literally that have been part of my life as an African living partly abroad for the last 3 months. And I think there are things that exist in what I call the real economy, not just I, but quite a lot of people. And then there's these two economies intersecting. And so you've had a fairly colorful career in what I'd consider both of those segments. And then I think we've bonded perhaps most meaningfully at your observations at the intersection of this imaginary that is slowly becoming real to some degree or to varying degrees, depending who you speak to, and this real economy we're all a part of, but tend to sort of take for granted because it's always been there, or it's almost uncool to talk about because, who needs to talk about like roads and hospitals and things when there are whizzier things to talk about like AI and crypto?
Yeah. it always struck me that a big discussion got going about DRC, about putting in a fiber network with DRC and connecting it to surrounding country. And if those plans were in place, then there would be more fiber by kilometer in DRC than there was actually roads. And it struck me that there's some dissonance here. Now, the World Bank has various projects to build roads with fiber alongside and so on and so forth. So it's not something that I alone have noticed. But it does seem to me that there are other things in particular. I put my finger on two things, one of which is access to electricity, because none of the digital good stuff comes without electricity. And the other one I would put my finger on is literacy. I had an interchange with a young African tech guy, and I was saying, actually, it's quite important that you can write
Not quite.
on the device.
Maybe that argument holds for
And he was
people who
saying, "No,
think
I've got
voice
my
is going to
mobile
take
phone, I
over, and
don't
now
need to
people can
write,
express
et cetera, et
themselves
cetera.
without ever needing to
Not
learn
actually
to read or
true.
write because they could just say things. But even then, there's the literacy aspect of knowing how to speak, or assuming again that everyone's going to be able to have a device that can translate them into a language of commerce as and when they need it without friction. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've touched on languages. Africa's great with languages, but actually, what do you do when a country has 3 different languages? How are you addressing people? You can say, we won't address them in the colonial language, but then actually, Rwanda's a good example.
How about 11
English
in South
and
Africa?
French,
11
neither
official
of them,
languages.
really. Kinyarwanda, yes, but that only deals with another proportion. So there's all those 11. And it's, to some extent, it is the Tower of Babel. And the difficulty is if you don't have literacy, then it's very difficult to develop certain things in a society, because actually, in order to program and in order to do a whole series of things, and literacy is a set of layers. Literacy is, can I read and write? And people are a bit nervous about saying it as straightforwardly as that. There's functional literacy, which is, can I read an airline timetable, or can I read a bus timetable, or can I read a menu? And then there's tech literacy, is fairly obvious. What people don't understand is in Europe, I had 10, 15 years of computers and laptops before I got to mobile phones. So I had a 10, 15-year education. I could tell you what an operating system was. I could tell you what software was because of that 10, 15-year day-to-day experience of using it. But if you've only ever used a mobile phone, a consultancy did a piece of work in Kenya and worked out that for a smartphone, there were 50 things that you needed to know in order to use the smartphone properly. So that is tech literacy. You have a lot in Africa of what I would call quite shallow use of mobile phones that
As you're speaking, I just realized there's the question of
define the
acquired
territory you're
discernment
looking at
that
rather
even in the
differently
context of what you
from
just described from a
happens in
literacy
Europe
perspective,
or what
is
happens
actually
in America.
knowing what's from a range of options, assuming all of them good, which ones are preferable and why, and having a sense of agency to actually pick and choose what suits you best in the context of, say, someone who's interacting with a fintech product for the first time that's giving them credit for the first time, as an example, via this mobile phone you just described, or an insurance product, and knowing what they're really in for, or what it's about to cost them in the short, medium, or long term, both in terms of upside or potential downside. And there's the other thing linked to this that what you were saying also stands out in terms of how much traction you in your personal capacity had in terms of adoption of these technologies before you started to interact with, or even start to think about how Africa might X, Y, Z and leveraging them to economic success of any kind. 2000 you mentioned. So I finished my O-levels with GCSEs in 2001. I was part of the first wave of students at my school, which was a private Christian school, which is one of the more privileged schools, certainly in the general Gweru area. But, I definitely had a privileged sort of high school, boarding school situation. I was part of the first wave in 2000 who took computer science or computer studies, as it was called, as an O-level subject, which ended up being my lowest pass in high school, or barely passed. But full disclosure, I never tried to get a job off the back of that result, by the way, so I don't mind putting it out there. But here's the point. I'd consider myself,
full
of
disclosure,
my generation, born 84, post-independence Zimbabwe, one of the more privileged young Black people of my generation, right? And so it's quite stunning to think that by the time you were interacting with Africa for the first time in 2000, you had what, nearly a decade plus on me, huh? In terms of like your active use and grasp, and not just grasp, your actual harnessing of these technologies.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't have done the newsletter I did without
Never
the technologies
Don't
being
bother,
in place. Because if you can imagine trying to distribute something using fax or sending it by post in sub-Saharan Africa, it would never happen. So something did change. And so I think one of the difficult things is optimism and pessimism, and trying to kind of constantly be sufficiently critical but sufficiently enthusiastic to say what's real, what's going on here, whereas at the same
without being
time giving
paternalistic or
everybody a
condescending.
chance to be able to do the best they can, to promote and do the best they can. Absolutely. And I came to the continent. I had no sense that I wanted to come to the continent.
Thanks for coming.
And air quotes, save it. That wasn't what I was here for. Yeah, no, absolutely. So take a pass on that one. But I was interested in getting to grips with what the reality of something was that allowed then people to themselves
so then,
understand
let's go
that,
back, because
so
there's
that
part
they
of
could
you that's
make
journalist,
their
there's
own
part of you that's
future.
consultant, you're
So in other
obviously
words,
author.
my role
You're
was
these
a
things, and I'm
passing
wondering in what order
was
your sort of exploration, your interest in Africa as a proposition nurtured? Like, did you see it, as some do, as this irresistible economic opportunity, last frontier, quote unquote, opportunity to do some of the greatest sort of capitalist enterprise of your life? Or do you see it as an open set of questions that you desire to sort of answer journalistically, systematically, to serve certain ends? Were you just interested in researching this? Had you landed interest from a client base that had some or all of these interests and you could serve into it? Like, what was the deal?
I came in 2000 and went to Kenya, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Uganda. When I landed, I had almost no contacts. So I would take out the yellow pages and look up internet service providers and designers, because I was kind of interested in design and thought,
I'm a journalist, I've got this newsletter,
And there were almost none of them. And you could turn up and I could say, I'm from London, I'm interested in the internet in Africa. Yeah, no, exactly. But at that stage, the newsletter didn't exist. I went and wrote it and said, this is what I did on my holidays. And people started sending me stuff. And it was an early decision that I made that I would share this, because in a sense, what I was doing was I was studying the subject that I wanted to know about. So I shared this information. Of course, you don't share all information, but you share large parts of what you had, and it was weekly, so it was quite a lot of information being shared. And through that, I began to understand kind of what the issues were, but it was very instinctive, and I understood very early on that monopolies.
So hang on. So and I want to get to that whole, like, what you found, because I think it's fascinating.
Getting stuff done,
and
to some degree
your
still are.
In sharing to start with as a ritual. So there was this ritual journalistic process of, I suppose, processing what you're learning from these observations of what you're doing. And then there's a decision on your part to publish it in a way that wasn't, I suppose, common in 2000 odd. And certainly open sourcing information that, to my mind, would have constituted fairly helpful, at very least, turnkey information about these new markets in a way that hadn't been presented before, that would have been locked into local minds and people who had experienced it by living there. I just wonder what internal conversations going on to like motivate that set of response to all this.
It's partly an understanding that if it was good enough, people would come to it. So it would create a village. And that's what it was. It was a village of people who are interested in things digital in Africa. And secondly, that in doing that, it was a form of intent. It was a way of saying, we now need to define the issues. Every week as I sat down, I had to say, what is important, what isn't important. I didn't get it right every... Yeah, exactly. You have to think, kind of, okay, well, why is this in here? Why is that in there? And that, particularly when it came to policy, became very quickly apparent that certain things, because people would talk to me and would explain, this is why X won't happen. So very quickly we get to the point of saying certain kinds of monopolies are actually preventing the price of internet coming down. And that was the first big understanding. And it took me to looking at the international cable that came to Africa that the South Africans built called SAT3, which was going to be a monopoly, indeed was a monopoly, of all the telecoms operators that connected along the coast. And we began by saying, well, why is it a monopoly? Can we see the contract? Oh, no, you can't see the contract because it's commercially sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually somebody sent us a copy of the contract. And of course, in there it says, should this need to be circulated, there's no problem with doing that. So you can see it was quite difficult. And I remember having a conversation with somebody in Telcom, and
this is Telcom South Africa, so this is South Africa's fixed line monopoly.
The only thing he would say to me was sort of name, rank, and serial number, and wouldn't have a conversation with me. Yeah.
Which I suppose is now speaking to that observation you're making. That also partially answers the first question I asked,
and those
which is
kinds
what
of
have you
difficulties
seen change
haven't completely gone
You're
away.
saying one of the things you haven't seen change as much as maybe you'd like is the fact that these are still matters, I suppose, intermediated by very powerful special interests, not least governments and, I suppose, their designated partners.
Yes, what you see is a form of government in which many of the decisions go up to the president or almost to that level and are taken by a very small number of people. So you don't have the ability to spread power across a group of people. That's different in different countries. But if you take somewhere like, I don't know, Cameroon, which is run by a 92-year-old who's about to stand for election again, you're going to get a very different result than you get, for all its faults, in Kenya or Nigeria, where there's
so someone listening who says, but how different is that to
the
dynamics in, say, London where you live, or any number of EU nations, which do appear to be fairly tightly controlled by a professional class of politicians, regulators, and policymakers?
Yeah, I don't think, though, you could have lived, speaking for my own country, the UK, I think you could have lived through the past decade and a half without all that not having been challenged. I might not like populist politics, but it has challenged all those previous assumptions of a comfortable elite. I might not like what Trump says, but it's the same thing. It challenges all of that comfortable elite to be accountable, to do and say things clearly in a public sense. And I think, too, the creation of more or less independent regulators in the industry created a separate power place, as it were, created a separate body which had, in some countries, the ability to actually, with all the kind of political nods in the direction of the president or whatever, make independent decisions.
I'm reading off your AI-generated bio here, Russell, which reminds me that you specialize in telecommunications, internet media, broadcasting across sub-Saharan Africa. And so I wonder if you've always seen those things as interrelated as part of one broader theme in light of what we're discussing now.
No, I was always interested in content.
Meaning
in a
what
broad
exactly?
sense.
What's
If you take content and services, actually, I always used to say that the internet is a big biro, and actually, it's something to write with. It's something you can express yourself with. It's something you can say things with, and it just becomes much more effective the more people are involved in it. Now, some of what has happened with social media makes that look.
Aren't you a fan of everything, Russell? Come on,
isn't
it all gravy?
As it might have been. Some of
Don't
the
you just love it?
things that are happening with AI make you go, kind of.
Maybe not.
Yeah, Always, always. Onwards and upwards. Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is that as techno-optimists, we were not good enough on saying that there were going to be things that simply reflected the cultures within which they operated, whether it was SMS messages or
Facebook
social
being
media being
leveraged
used
to,
for fights between two ethnic groups, or whether it was all sorts of
or sway
unpleasant things
elections or whatever
happening
it
in the
is. Yeah.
political sphere.
So
Yeah, to
the whole
harass women,
techno-optimist thing,
to
I find it
scam people,
humorous,
or
sometimes
exactly, or
disheartening,
fix
how
elections.
unwilling we are to
All of
contend
that.
with the reality of the human condition. Now, I think a lot of people philosophically will differ with me in terms of my wholehearted belief that we are dysfunctional beings. And to your point, a lot of our use of some of the most celebrated technologies of our time tends to just awkwardly reflect dysfunctions that perhaps would otherwise have gone unnoticed or perhaps not as severely amplified. And so differ with me on that if you will. But here's the thing. I think we are, many of us, driven to two binary extremes unhelpfully. And perhaps to tap your nuance in thinking about Africa's digital transformation trajectory as this open check, like the future is going to be crazy amazing for all of us because, I don't know, because internet, because telecommunications, because look at decentralization or democratization of media. Like, thank goodness someone like you started a newsletter and didn't wait around, for a publisher to give them a voice, or, broadcasting. Thank goodness that's like open source and we can all TikTok and be famous. So I think there's a way to think about opportunity in that regard as just blank check, optimistic, amazing, can't wait for the future, let's go get it. Or we can sit here again, as some people would criticize the first part of our conversation so far and think, you guys don't seem very sort of bullish on Africa and you seem to be pinpointing at all the things that aren't working and we don't need to be reminded just how far behind we are everything, or just there's more to life than AI. Like, there's a sense in which there are people who say, yes, we do. If we don't, we'll never have roads or hospitals or, dig up trenches and actually put real infrastructure down that makes a difference. Something needs to be in the middle somehow, don't you think?
No, absolutely. I think what was really interesting about the mobile revolution and what it did was that it
Just you
put
wait
up
till
all
you
those
get a
billboards
3310. Like,
with
your
happy
life will
families
never be the same.
communicating with mobile phones. And of course, no, exactly. And at one level, it was
Yeah.
nonsensical, but on another level, it was also aspirational. So people could look at that and say, yes, the good life, I can get the good life. And I remember having a conversation in South Africa with one of the leading broadcasters where he was saying, when people see stuff on television, they say to themselves, those people have got those things. Why haven't I got those things? Not in a kind of horrible way, but actually, that's the good life. That's what I want. So it does seem to me that the digital imaginary, as we've described it, there is somewhere in that what tomorrow will look like. It's just one has to keep one's feet on the ground and not imagine that Africa is going to be somewhere where stuff is manufactured tomorrow, or stuff where software is going to be written tomorrow that will be world changing. That actually, if we've talked about a set of changes and they've taken quarter of a century, and you were doing your information technology O level and, I had 10 to 15 years, actually, it may take 15, 20 years for all of this to occur. And for the economies, the real economies of Africa to change, because there is in the book, and I don't suppose it's enormously different now, one of the entrepreneurs who did a job site was telling me that in Finland, there were 40,000 real jobs at any given point in a population of 5 million, whereas in Kenya, there were only 2,000 jobs in a population of 40 million. So you can see that the economies have to make some distance, the real economies that we've been talking about, and I believe that will occur. The thing not to lose sight of is that from nothing, communications became a major part of the economy, second only after mineral extraction and oil. It created something like 12,000 new jobs. It created a multinational cadre of Africans who had skills that they didn't have before. So it's not that nothing has happened. It's just trying
That's
to
a
keep
good way
one's
to
feet
put
on
it.
the
But then
ground and saying,
I wonder
okay,
for you
what
then,
can be done now?
and I'm glad you brought up the
and
book,
what
which,
can be
of
done in
course, in
5
case
years'
you missed it
time?
in
And those
Russell's
might be different
intro,
things.
Africa 2.0, Inside a Continent's Communications Revolution. Excellent read. And so what stands out to you then as some of your favorite sort of inflection point, call it moments, anecdotes, if you will, acknowledging the tendency towards oversimplification? It's asking you this question so that you feel free to like point to them as your random favorite moments in time, rather than things that you feel pressure to point to as pivotal to where things needed to go or where things are headed. And here I'd like to tap into you as a journalist, as an agenda setter in your context as a new media publisher. They used to call us back in the day new media people, but also accounting for your pragmatic sense of the interests you were interacting with as far as being a consultant to the likes of the World Bank and other people. What stands out to you as some of those favorite turnkey anecdotes that you might wish people talked about more or remembered?
I think it's why history is important. If you look at M-Pesa, there were actually money transfer systems, Celtel. Guys from Celtel had gone from, going to the airport in DRC, had noticed these guys alongside the road with stacks of money, and, they were transferring money on a kind of trust basis between cities because the banking system didn't work in DRC. Now, there wasn't the level of trust available to make that work. And then along came M-Pesa, and M-Pesa is always seen as a kind of Kenyan product. But actually, it was partly Africans were already transferring time, bought time, credits from one phone to another. And DFID comes along and puts some money in it. Somebody persuades DFID. There's a whole series of people in there making that. And it almost happens accidentally. And then it happens in Kenya, and absolutely everybody grips it. But it can't get out of Kenya because everybody has all the same problems of trust and so on and so forth. So it takes an awfully long time and an understanding of the practical stuff that makes it then, if you like, migrate. And it's still migrating and it's still taking time, but actually a whole ecosystem for payment has been created that is real, that involves all sorts of people being able to get money from one place to another that used to travel by bus. And that speeds things up. It makes things happen much more quickly. Just another quick anecdote, which was every time I was in Africa in the back of a cab and you were saying to somebody, where are we going? They would ring either the company that ran the cab or they would ring a friend and say, where is this? Where's it near? So we would get to near where it was, and there'd be a big conversation about, is it this and is it that? And another ringing, and on you went. And a
Do you remember the
real
first time that
breakthrough,
happened?
again,
Or
happened in Kenya,
wow,
where
okay.
the guy said, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to look at Google Maps. And I pulled it up, and yeah, I can very clearly, because I thought, geez. And it's about behavior change. It's about people saying, I'm going to do something in a different way. And the problem with entrepreneurs, with people like ourselves who are analysts who look at it, we think, well, this is obvious. It's kind of logical. It's, why wouldn't you do it that way? Because it's so much quicker. But actually, it doesn't always work that way. People have particular behaviors. Sometimes for the people who have no money, those particular logical behaviors require money so they don't occur, and so on and so forth. And the success of M-Pesa, which is a lesson that I can't give over and over again too much, is that the middle classes and the people with
So
money
like that
used
real, that
M-Pesa,
digital
people
economy and
without
real
money
economy
used
situation.
M-Pesa,
There's a
and there was an
marriage there.
interrelationship between those two sets of people. If somebody wanted to pay, exactly, they came together. If you wanted to pay your gardener or your maid or your driver, this is how it happened. So the driver knew this was the quickest way. You didn't have to wait and say, boss, you haven't paid me yet. It happened, and it happened there and then. And was very, very different. And another weird anecdote, I used to sitting in a Kenyan ISP's office at a certain time of the month, and a series of people came in bearing envelopes full of money, paying their bills. This was how bill paying was done. And it would take you an hour to get there, and it would take you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all of those things. And that makes me tremendously optimistic that once you get below the hype, once you get below the who's selling what to whom.
And of course, everyone's assuming like a certain market size and a certain addressable market size, not accounting for certain dynamics or evolutions in adoption or sort of consumer dynamics that you are describing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Africa, too, has this sort of problem of everything slightly has to be oversold because the people who have the VC capital have raised
and lift entire generations out of poverty at the same time. Also,
and as a result, it has to reach women in villages. It has to reach, so there's a whole set of impacts.
Africa is now. It's Africa now.
Absolutely.
It's Africa rising.
As well as make unicorn sums of funding.
The future is Africa. It's all returns, all right now, and it won't happen without my startup and this deck I'm pitching.
All right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And some of those people who knew nothing now know something. And, if you take something like Tayo Obiliosu from Paga, kind of fantastic, several decade journey creating a large scale business. And I respect, that I can see. Other people knew nothing, know something now, but not enough to make the business successful. And, a lot of it goes. And of course, I've had conversations with people in, VCs and in development who say, oh yeah, but there's going to be failures because that's, we're looking for the 2.5 unicorns or whatever. But that
so Russell, you just leaned into a question I was going to ask, but you've already started to answer, which was, what do you think we're missing
looking in the mirror and
when we don't account for the history telling you just shared or the reflections on anecdotes like yours? I suppose M-Pesa is at this point like the default response by major Afro-optimists whenever M-Pesa is raised is like, come on, guys, we've got bigger things going right now. But there's some benefit to picking apart the micro lessons, some of which you've touched on here. And I think a great place for us to wrap this up is leaning into something you've intimated, which is the early stage VC interest that has literally put on blast the big African opportunity vis-a-vis tech, vis-a-vis how tech is going to drive the future and how that future starts now, and getting in now early is the smartest thing apparently you can do, whether you're thinking about this from an impact perspective or a commercial perspective or a hybrid of both. And you touched on a very touchy, thorny subject, which is some of the special interests that are riding on these narratives. I think, to be fair to a lot of them, perhaps well-meaning, accounting for what we've so far seen technology lend itself to shaping futures, not least this conversation we're having. Look at how I've technically caught up with where you were 2000 in terms of us being on a call decades later as peers of sorts, notwithstanding the years you had on me in terms of becoming a publisher, a journalist, a proponent within digital and innovation. I think even this conversation and our professional association could make this point, right? Could be like, this is what technology can do. So accounting for that, however, we have to ask ourselves, and I have to ask you, what you make of the VC, I suppose it's tempered now given, VC winter the world is generally in, but certainly the VC bullishness that has shaped perception of what the opportunity is, and therefore what investment or savvy entrepreneurship interest or savvy career building in the space should be for anyone who's either African or Africa interested or Africa focused as an investor, so I wonder what you make of the last 15 years, accounting for your history and what you've observed, VC specifically.
I think that the interesting people take the time to try and understand what is happening and don't rush to selling something. When I had the conversation with Tai Obviosu about Paga, he was saying when he first launched it, what he wanted to do was create a payment system that he was comfortable with and dealt with his kind of needs, and that there would be more people like him out there. But he realized quite early on that actually there were other people out there who had different kinds of needs and would require a system that was very different. And it's that we go back to the same thing, same as everywhere, different. And I think it's the people who will take the long view, but also be realistic. Because again, I had a conversation with a VC investor, I guess you would call, in Nigeria, who was saying that, yeah, I've got X number of businesses and 3 of them now are businesses which are not going anywhere, but the guys who are running it just don't realize that's the case. And so there is that thing of, am I succeeding at this? Is it breaking through? And the difficulty always, and I've listened and talked to lots and lots of African startups, is the point at which you say, I'm going to go into another country. And those that have succeeded in going into another country, it seems to me, are making some way towards what the future is, because it's sort of knitting the continent together. It's creating businesses that are transferable and so on and so forth. So Paga has gone off into Ethiopia. It didn't get to Mexico, which it was also talking about. But you have somebody like Twiga, who have recently stopped delivering and are redefining the business and reworking it. And I was an early enthusiast of Twiga. And there were many good reasons for that. It seemed like it met a need and so on and so forth. And I think, for all sorts of reasons we were wrong. Didn't get to be in Tanzania, didn't get out of one country. And actually startups won't, in the main, succeed in one country alone. Startups, if they are to be the transformative element of African business, need to be able to find, and Africa has 5 to 10 countries which are the launch pad for something that will be pan-continental businesses that will change what can be done and change how people do it in the next 5 to 10 years.
Notwithstanding valuations.
No, indeed.
And wasn't Twiga like one of the most bankable, VC bets of its generation when it, in the first 5 odd years of its existence? And by the way, that says nothing about how well attempted, not that I know everything there is to know about that business, but having interviewed and spoken to members of that team early on, I don't think you were foolish or naive to think they were onto something. However, I think part of what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there's an opportunity now for us to mature our sense of how we frame what good looks like. Some of the more binary sensibilities of, is this a winner, is this not? Some of the oversimplifications about what truly constitutes investability. I think the conflation of sometimes well-meaning attempts to build ecosystem capacity. Even the internet had to have the US government's proper army dollars to to building that out as an infrastructure. So I think there's a way to acknowledge that certain things need to exist for their sake before there's an economic case for them. But the question for me is often forcing dishonestly or unhelpfully the idea of these matters as an economic case with immediate commercial returns linked to them actually turns our ecosystem into a place where people's dreams come to die or disappointments are groomed unnecessarily. And then we all come across like we've been selling, fake dreams about a future that is either not going to happen or not at all foundationally possible.
But I think also, too, one of the things that I've said, and I think is probably still true, is that the digitalization of government, the digitalization of existing businesses begins to change certain things. And some of that has happened. Some ministries, when I started, you go to the Ministry of Education in one country and the computer was used for the guys to put his jacket on. And now people are using those computers. You wouldn't think of not having them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that process of, the long march through multinational companies, local large enterprises, et cetera, taking in digital is part of this process of the deepening of the process of the promise. The promise starts there in a way, and the skills, because the skills that are required, the number of people who know anything about large language models in sub-Saharan Africa is probably vanishingly small. And I am happy if people start throwing rocks at me and saying, yes, actually, we all know about it. But it's kind of...
Let's say this, Russell. If you're one of those people, give us a shout. I'd love to hear about work you're doing. Maybe have you on the podcast here.
That would be good.
Genuinely speaking, we're all a part of the history you describe in your book. Some of us later to the party, admittedly, than others. But I think we all have something to say, particularly those of us who have the privilege of shaping those futures in practical ways, embedded in the corporates or the governments or the regulators or the DFIs we've been referencing on this call. It'd be amazing to hear from anybody listening to this podcast, reflecting in practical, anecdotal, and maybe actionable insight terms, what they're learning from their experience. And so to that end, hit us up via email. It's andile@africantechroundup.com if you want to reach out to me directly. Otherwise, it's African Tech Roundup on LinkedIn and @African Roundup on X. Yeah, please, by all means, DM us, let us know what's happening. And Russell, I want to thank you, but not before I ask you one final question, particularly about this book, because I presume since writing it, you've received some interesting feedback. What would you say is your top reaction, unexpected or otherwise, pushback after you dropped the book?
I think the toughest thing was reaching conclusions, because it's a story that will run for decades, and actually saying something meaningful at this point is very hard. So I think, there are various people who said things about the conclusions, which I think are absolutely right, which is they seem very tentative, they seem very provisional. But I think that's how it is. Africa's busy being made, and certain parts of Africa hopefully are busy dying. But, kind of in that process comes a very different future.
I quite appreciated that tone in the book, which in my thinking, the difference between observation and value judgment. And I think we're in a culture which typically conflates the two all the time, or leaps to value judgment without clear observation, or even just reflecting agnostically on observation. I felt like your book did that for me in a way that I found refreshing. I think you obviously have lots of minefields to walk as being an outsider trying to tell the story from your purview, and I think you handled that very nicely. But to whoever gave you that feedback, I'd say, again, I maybe agree with you in saying you certainly didn't impose an Oxford or Cambridge level thought leadership, stake in the ground, therefore this, that, and the other, which can be annoying, by the way, for some authors. But I also do appreciate that it does leave it up to us to be part of how this pans out. And I hope this conversation adds to that end meaningfully. So with thanks from the village, Russell Southwood, thank you so much for being on the African Tech Roundup.
Good to talk to you.